Hello and welcome back to the Imagination Podcast. I'm your host, Tony Blair. This program is sponsored by the PhD and THD programs at Kairos University. Today, I have no guest to interview because I screwed up the schedule, and I'm taking advantage of the opportunity since it was my mistake to present some of my own research, something I'm still very passionate about on the roots of what I'm calling the competitive religious marketplace, particularly in the North American context. Now, what do I mean by that? If you walk down any main street in, say, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, which is where I live and where I serve as a pastor and where I'm broadcasting from today, or really it could be any town in America. I use Lancaster because it's part of the Pennsylvania Bible Belt and perhaps illustrates some of these dynamics fairly well. If you do this, you've walked on the street, you'll see something that we've come to take for choice, to take for granted, choice. Within a 3 mile radius, you can have a high steepled Presbyterian church and a warehouse style, non denominational mega church, a traditional Methodist chapel, a Baptist congregation. In my small town, there are 30 some churches of so many, a bewildering variety of denominational theological traditions. Each one has a sign, each one has its own website, and if we're honest, each one is in some way or another competing with each other. And the same is true of other ministries that are not churches. My county is home to a number of mission agencies and several institutions of theological education and a variety of youth ministry networks and some dynamic Christian social service ministries and other parachurch organizations that partner with churches to deliver services to people that need them. They are incredibly good organizations for the most part. And I have friends and networks in most of them. But these organizations are often appealing to the same donors, drawing from the same core group of volunteers, pleading with the same churches for help, working the same relational networks for support. When I was a seminary president, I was there along with the rest of them, trying to do the same thing. Ministry success, then, as a result, is defined by building one's own organization or brand in the marketplace, likely at the expense of someone else. And obviously, this is not always well received. We often blame this competitive spirit on modern consumerism, and yes, that has indeed accelerated the spirit of competitiveness. But what I observed taking place in 2026 is really merely recent manifestations of a much deeper, much older pattern. The roots of this competitive religious marketplace, I argue, go much deeper, and understanding the roots of it might help us figure out if there's ever going to be a way, a solution out of it. They go back to a specific hinge point in the 18th century, 280 years ago, where the very definition of what it meant to belong to a church shifted forever, at least in the North American context. And of course, as Mark Noll and others have argued, much of what has been adopted as understanding of church and the way churches are run and leadership in much of the rest of the world has been derived from the North American context. We've exported that along with our missionary efforts. So we bear some responsibility for the fact that this competitive religious marketplace exists in places outside of the U.S. as well. So today I want to explore fairly quickly here how we move from a parish model, where a church was defined by geography, by the ground underneath your feet, to a voluntary association model, where the church became a product and the congregation became a customer. And we're going to look at what was called at the time the invasion of the itinerants and the triumph of the laity and the long-term harm of turning the gospel into a commodity. So this began with my dissertation research, which is now 30 years old, my PhD in American history. It resulted in a dissertation and a book called Fire Across the Water, Transatlantic Dimensions of the Great Awakening. The dissertation title went to, you got more narrow among middle colony Presbyterians. And I was looking at specific community dynamics in this region of the country where I live, but noticing that those dynamics had a wider scope and influence, and some similar patterns have been noted in New England, and patterns continued, obviously, past the generation of the Great Awakening. I researched how early Presbyterians in the Middle Colonies understood their place in the world. Now, they brought with them across the Atlantic a parish model of ministry, and this was the European standard. In a parish system, the church was a geographic monopoly. If you lived within certain boundaries, usually defined by waterways, at least here in Pennsylvania, the creek, the river, perhaps the mountain, your church was automatically assigned to you. You didn't choose a congregation. If you were a believer, you were automatically a member of the church in that parish. In fact, even if you weren't a believer, which was very rare in those days, at least in some kind of formal identification with some branch of Christianity, you may have been baptized nonetheless into that church, the local one, the parish church as an infant, and therefore were in some way attached to it anyway. So therefore, the minister of that congregation wasn't just a preacher that you happened to find inspiring and that you would choose to go and listen to on Sundays. He was the preacher for that territory, for that parish. And there was this beautiful logic to this. It assumed a theology of place. It assumed that the church was, well, in a contemporary example, was like a public utility, like a well or a road or electric company. You didn't shop for a well, you used the one in your village. And the church was in the village, and churches were identified with particular communities. In fact, most communities, because they were settled, at least originally, by people of similar ethnic origins, really only had one church. It was only in later generations when Americans started assimilating a bit more and people from different ethnic origins began to inhabit the same places and spaces that we would see multiple, what we would now call denominations emerge. But even then, sometimes they had a sense of parishes within their own tribe. But anyway, as the 1730s turned into 1740s, this fire began to cross the water, the Great Awakening, which began really in Britain, got exported to the colonies. And it wasn't just a series of revivals. It was that, but it was also had some profound social implications and cultural implications, including a reimagining of the concept of church. So, for instance, one of the most famous itinerants of that era, George Whitefield, his preaching all over Wales and England and Scotland and places back home. But he makes 7 trips over to the American colonies to preach as well. And he and other itinerants like him didn't respect parish boundaries. They went wherever they had an invitation or wherever they could find an audience. And not just the famous ones, not just the celebrities. In Pennsylvania, here, a Presbyterian minister named William Tennant founded a small training institution in Pennsylvania for itinerant ministers. He did this at Neshaminy, which is outside Philadelphia. It was mockingly called the Log College. Of course, it didn't compare to the great European institutions that those who were immigrants had attended, but for those who were American born and for whom that was prohibitive in some ways, this was welcome relief. The students embraced the name. They were proud graduates of the Log College. And its graduates spread out all over the Pennsylvania countryside and into New Jersey and down to Maryland, down the Shenandoah Valley into Virginia, wherever the Presbyterian settlers and their children ended up expanding into. Gilbert Tennant, one of William Tennant's 4 sons, became a national regional leader of those revivalists. And so if a local parish minister was seen as cold or unconverted, which, by the way, was the critique and made famous by Gilbert Tennant, he wrote a tract called The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry, in which he basically told people, you evaluate the spiritual health of your minister, and if you assess that your minister has not had this conversion, this experiential encounter with God that transforms them, then you should not be listening to them, and you should be listening to somebody who has had that experience. So the itinerants didn't wait for permission. They made those judgments themselves, and they would invade a parish. They would set up rival preaching points in the backyard of the established parish. And then they would compete for souls. Often, as I said, denouncing the old side. That was the term for the anti-revivalists, or those that were regarded as unconverted. They would denounce the old side minister as insufficiently converted or knowledgeable about the ways of God. And therefore, we would end up, for instance, as in the study that I did, two Presbyterian congregations, churches, leaders, pastors in the same community now. Old side versus new side. Oh my, this is new. What do we do about this? It was the first crack in this old model. For the first time, the person in the pew had a choice. Do I still stay with this old side minister who holds the deed to the land, who's the one who's been formally assigned, or to go out to the field and hear the new side preacher, who maybe, in my view, holds the fire of the Spirit? Now, this brings us to another point then, to the work of Marilyn Westerkamp, and a book that I relied on heavily in my own research. Her seminal book, the title of which says it all, The Triumph of the Laity. Westerkamp argues, and this is a pattern I saw in my own study, that the revivals essentially handed the keys of the church over to the lay people. I'm not, by the way, critiquing this. I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I'm a big believer in the priesthood of all believers, which Protestants have been arguing for the last 500 years and have seldom practiced. So it would be kind of fun to imagine what this could look for. But the form that this took as a result of the revivals is what I'm addressing here. When the laity realized that they could choose their preacher based upon the quality of the message or the fervor of the experience, the power dynamic shifted. It was no longer the clergy who were deciding who was worthy of membership. It was now the laity deciding who was worthy of leadership, whom they would follow, and whom they would financially support. The minister then is no longer simply a presbytery authorized, much less in Europe, a state sanctioned official. He, and it was always a he in those days, became a candidate for the people's loyalty, a candidate. This was the birth of the voluntary association model of church. Instead of being born into a church, or you may have been born into a church, but you could choose to join a church. Now, the Anabaptists had started this already 200 years before, but the Anabaptist model was not a dominant model in Europe and had not yet been a dominant model in most of the American colonies. And even in the Mennonite communities here in Lancaster County, there was still a sense of place. The Anabaptist, the Mennonite church in this community was the one that you would connect to. They had, even though they voluntarily chose to disassociate with other Protestant movements, they still saw themselves as being rooted in community and rooted in parishes. So anyway, instead of you join one church, even if it's not the one you're born into, and you would choose one instead of another, or instead of a bunch of others, because now there was options. And if you joined it voluntarily, what was the implication? You could leave it voluntarily too. And this created a new kind of pressure on the clergy. If you wanted to keep your building, if you wanted your salary to be paid, if you wanted to keep your position, you had somehow to keep members, and you had to keep your people happy, or at least fulfilled. So in my own research, I compared the relative socioeconomic status of those who chose the revivalist churches as opposed to those who stayed put in the original congregations. And I found a curious pattern, but it was noticed elsewhere, that the revivalist churches were comprised of people who tended to be younger, poorer, and more mobile than their counterparts. I was reconstructing land rolls and tax rolls and trying and identify individuals and figure out who was where and who was who and how much wealth they had. And this pattern seemed to hold kind of across the board. In other words, the parents went to the old side churches and their adult children went to the new side churches. Or the employers are old side and the employees were new side. Or the old timers, the pillars of the community, were anti-revivalists, and the newcomers were pro-revivalists. And I was intrigued by this pattern. Why would it be? Well, I came up with a theological answer to that socio-economic question, that the message of the revivalists was inherently democratizing. In other words, if we want to put it in revivalist language, wealth and status meant nothing before Christ and eternity. All were equal at the foot of the cross. And that experience of conversion was available and even necessary in their view for everyone. regardless of your status in society. So a young poor migrant who had been transformed by a spiritual experience might have believed himself better in a spiritual sense than the older, wealthier patrons of the community in which he was trying to establish roots. He didn't have to wait in line and wait for 50 years and accumulate wealth and status in order to be welcomed into that community or be treated on an equal basis. Now, this had all sorts of implications again. John Butler, a historian of the revival, is noted in A Wash in a Sea of Faith that this period, in one sense, de-Christianized. I think he maybe goes a little too far with that word, but what he says, it demolished the last vestiges of medieval Christendom. It stripped away those the old models and the legal protections of the old denominations, and it forced them to start from scratch. They had to compete on an open basis with newer movements. They had to build brands in our more modern marketing language. They had to distinguish themselves. Are we the emotional ones? Are we the orderly ones? By the way, one of the big fights in the revivals was how emotional could you get and still be deeply spiritual? The old side folks pronounced strongly against enthusiasm, which meant a little bit different than it does these days, but they were worried that there was too much emotionalism going on in the revivals. It's a debate we still have to this day, particularly perhaps in some of our Pentecostal circles. How much do we allow this experience of the Spirit to manifest itself in our behaviors and in our emotions and the other parts of our body? How much do we make it a purely cognitive experience? What do we do with our faith and how it's expressed, particularly when we come together? So by the time we get to the mid 70s, the market had arrived in American colonies, and there really was no going back, and there has been no going back in the last 270, 80 years. And we find this trend continues then. So as we move into the 19th century, it actually accelerates. Nathan Hatch is another American, a scholar of American Christianity. And his book, The Democratization of American Christianity, points out that after the American Revolution, this sovereignty of the audience, it became the absolute rule. And so we see a shift in the movements that people are following. The denominations that won the 19th century in this competitive marketplace, particularly the Methodists and the Baptists, were the ones that embraced the market most effectively. They were mobile. They used vernacular language. They were emphasizing the experience of faith. And they also appealed, as those revivalist Presbyterians of the previous century had, to those who were young and poor and more mobile. In fact, they were willing to use clergy who fit that same description. Instead of requiring that their clergy obtain the expensive theological education in established institutions here or abroad, they were willing to use lay people. They were willing to use an uneducated clergy who nonetheless had that conversion experience and could speak passionately about it and invite others to experience it as well. And this was key to their growth. Now, this is where Lawrence Moore's work, Selling God, his subtitle is Religion in the Marketplace of Culture. So you see, he's going the same way I'm going. This is where he helps us understand the phenomenon that occurred here as we move into the 19th century. The American government disestablished religion. The early colonial governments tended to have established faith in many of the colonies, but after they were disestablished, clergy were forced to become more entrepreneurial. And Moore points out that churches just didn't compete with each other. They also competed with secular entertainment, as we still do. So to get people into the pews, churches started using the tools of the theater and the lecture circuit and the printing press in order to appeal to the kind of things that people were interested in. They realized, or they argued at least, that in a free market, truth isn't enough to sustain the institution. You needed to get people's attention. So this led to the commodification of the faith. We see it in the 19th century with elaborate choir performances and these grandiose buildings that started to be built. Church buildings were not like that for the most part in the 18th centuries. We see it in celebrity preachers, and we still have that problem in the 21st century, don't we? People like Charles Finney and Dwight Moody, and we see it in the birth of religious advertising. And without maybe perhaps going too far with this, the church became for some a store and the sermon became a product. Now, that's not to say they weren't authentic in what they were preaching, only that they felt like they had to use what Finney called the new methods to get the attention of people. And some of my favorite stories, probably nobody did this better than the turn of the century evangelist Billy Sunday. He was a former professional baseball player. So he would, as part of his act, would sometimes run into the camp meeting tent and slide into the pulpit as if he's stealing second base. And then he would begin his sermon. Talk about attention getting. He would have an audience then. And of course, he was highly dramatic in the way that he preached in order to keep his audience. So if we think that the marketing pastor is a 21st century invention, and there have been some shifts, particularly since 1980, which I regard as kind of a pivotal point in this movement toward the pastor as a CEO. But more does remind us that a lot of these trends were already in motion back in the 19th century. There was this pressure to be a salesperson, and it's baked into the soil of American church life. And those roots, as I said, go back to the 18th century when churches would be funded solely by the voluntary customers in the pews. So, what's the cost of all this? Let's move past the historical analysis for a moment. As a pastor myself, I see the toll this takes. I've been a pastor for over 40 years, and I've been dealing with this for over 40 years, sometimes more successfully than others. When we operate in a marketplace, the success of a ministry is often defined. It's measured by, there's different ways of wording it, the three B's: butts, bucks, and bricks. How many butts are in the seat? How many bucks are in the offering? How many bricks are in the building? Or as some put it, the ABCs: attendance, buildings, and cash. We tend to measure metrics according to what in a consumer marketplace is bigger, better, and faster. And that's the way that I tend to describe it. We got to become addicted to bigger, better, and faster, and we think that's what spiritual success is. I got addicted to that as a young pastor, and I got pretty good at that in my first decade in ministry at building things that were bigger, better, faster. And I had good career growth and kept getting promoted to larger churches because I knew how to do those kind of things until, let's just say, God relieved me of that addiction and introduced a different way of looking at things for me. One of the problems, first, there's several problems. First, it pressures the clergy, as I said, to be marketers. Not rather than shepherds, but on top of being shepherds, and it's kind of hard to do both at the same time. We spend our time wondering if our brand is fresh enough. And I see pastors' conferences and people talking about these things, and we always have to chase the latest fad and follow the latest how-to book, and it gets wearisome after a while. We worry about retention. What are we going to do? People are going to leave. How do we get new people to come in? We're tempted, of course, to avoid difficult conversations because we don't want the customers to take their business down the street. We deem ourselves and others failures if people leave our church for another one down the street. There's so many pastors, there's a reason that there's such a retention problem in the church these days among church leaders, because that is devastating to those who have been trained that this is the measure of success. And if people leave, then obviously you are a failure as a leader and maybe as a spiritual person. We deem ourselves spiritually healthy and excellent leaders if we persuade people to leave their church down the street and come to ours. Oh, God has blessed our ministry because they're coming to us. That's the way we interpret these things. And it turns this prophetic voice into a customer service department if we're not careful. And we're measuring the quality of our spiritual life by how many people are listening to us, which, by the way, is not modeled in the life of Jesus, because in the third year of his ministry, he lost most of his followers. One of the most haunting passages in the Gospels is where he looks at his disciples and said, "Are you going to leave me too?" All those throngs had been following him around as long as he was passing out bread and doing miracles, left him when he started talking about hard things. And so if the motto of Jesus means anything to us, perhaps we can break free from bigger, better, faster. I've been arguing for decades now that the motto of the kingdom of God is always simpler, smaller, and slower. And often the Bible makes it clear we must lose a little bit in order to accomplish what God has given us to do. The second thing it does, besides what it does to leaders, what it does to laity is not good as well. It's not healthy. It turns laity into consumers. In a voluntary association model, loyalty is paper thin. The music is too loud, or coffee is too cold, or God forbid the pastor says something that challenges our politics or our comfort, we shop someplace else, often without a second thought about biblical admonitions regarding relationships and community. And here's where it gets really hard at times. It's not uncommon for someone to be part of a congregation for decades and without a word, suddenly leave and go somewhere else, abandoning membership commitments and ministry responsibilities and ongoing relationships and even any commitment to simple honesty. Nothing is more heartbreaking for ministry leaders. Been there, done that myself. Walked with many other people through the experience. People have been trained by 280 years of history to believe that the church exists to meet our needs rather than us existing to serve the mission of God, which means the hard work of being in community with people and being in community where sometimes things are challenging to us. And the third implication, of course, then, well, besides what it does to leaders and to laity, is what it does to the church. It can and often does divide the church. American Christianity is one of the most fragmented expressions of Christianity anywhere in church history. And we have exported that model to other cultures as well, as I've said. The marketplace thrives on niche marketing. So we find the church that fits our specific demographic or our specific musical taste or our specific social class. And let me speak to this one for a moment. For the past 10 years, that fits our politics. There's data out now to suggest that people choose their church based more on political matters, political factors, than the church's theological position. In fact, most Americans are so poorly trained theologically, they don't even know. They don't know what these labels mean. And the brands that we have spent the last 280 years developing, they don't necessarily know what that means. What is Presbyterian? What is Methodist? What they're interested in. More than that is whether that church is going to preach their politics or not. And that grieves me deeply. Particularly because I'm one who doesn't believe that a church should be preaching partisan politics anyway. And you can disagree with me on that if you wish. The parish model at least used to force us to sit next to people that we didn't necessarily like because they were our neighbors and we had to. And that challenges us to love people that we may not find likable. The market model, the voluntary association model, allows us to sit under with people who are just like us. And therefore, we don't have to be troubled by dissenting voices or differing perspectives on how the kingdom of God is played out in the real world. So this trend that began in the 1740s has gifted us with vitality and zeal, and American Christianity is in some respects alive and kicking, but has also fragmented the body of Christ into 1,000 different competing brands. By the way, even within denominations, my joke as a seminary president was that I had to, because we were competing for dollars and everything too, I had to learn to speak all the different dialects of this bewildering array of churches. And there were 5 dialects of Mennonite to speak, and 3 or 4 dialects of Methodist, and the Brethren had about 5 different groups, and so even the larger categories have been divided into smaller competing groups who use different language and looked at things a little different way. And to honor those commitments, I had to learn how to address people in that variety of things. Honoring that is one thing, but we can also perhaps at the same time grieve that we have become so fragmented. So anyway, where do we go from here? Let me finish up. We can't go back to the 1730s. We can't legally mandate parishes. I'm not advocating, by the way, that we voluntarily recreate them. We live in a pluralistic voluntary society, however. However, maybe we can begin by acknowledging the market for what it is. And we can realize that our consumer instincts are historical byproduct and not a spiritual fruit. That maybe things went awry somewhere along the way, and own that and claim that. Maybe we can begin to see them then and resist those impulses a little bit. We can choose to stay when it feels uncomfortable. We can choose to shepherd without marketing. We can try to recover a theology of place, even in a world of endless choice. One way to do this, by the way, is for churches in a community to see themselves as on the same mission and in the same kingdom and begin to honor one another instead of just competing with one another. Perhaps we can recognize that the church down the street is serving the same community we are, and maybe we can turn them into collaborators. My own congregation did something a few years back that maybe it's time for us and others to do again. We did in those days take an occasional Sunday off of worship in our building and go out into our community to serve people. Other churches have done that thing. We had, however, one team of people that would travel to one church after another in our community and pray for them in their parking lot with permission, of course, and we always explained this up front. We didn't want anybody to wonder what we were up to. And of course, we would pray for them, not against them, as would be the temptation, I think, sometimes. We prayed that the brethren church around the corner from us would be all that God wanted for them, that they would flourish, that they would prosper in their mission because God had a purpose for them. And the same for the Methodists and the Catholics and the Mennonites and even that mega church down the road that seemed like it was constantly trying to steal away all of our people. We did not want to see them as competitors. We wanted them to be the best version of themselves that they could be. And we were praying that God would make us the best version of ourselves that we could be. There was one kingdom, one gospel, one tribe, and yes, in the end, one church. So we won't solve this one today or anytime soon, but perhaps one of the things that might arise out of our highly polarized generation might be a new sense of unity in the next generation. That's one of my passions. This is one of the things I keep pouring into people. My generation has accelerated this trend. We've created this problem. I'm praying that the next generation will shuck it off to some degree, that the challenges of our own time will cause them to reevaluate and look at things and find ways to build unity that have not existed before. So that's what I'm encouraging you to still in your own leadership, in your own context, and your own personal faith. Thanks so much.